Thank you everyone. I just want to start by thanking Mr. Kim and Janice for inviting me and for their tireless work in this field. And thanks all of you for listening to me and all the speakers. I've been really impressed by your attention. It's not a given at all, so thank you. So just a little bit about me. I grew up as a teenager in London when bombs were going off on buses, in shops, and in military centres. They were being planted by the IRA paramilitary group who was fighting to bring an end to British rule in Northern Ireland. And the British government wouldn't speak to the political wing of this terrorist group. And whenever I saw their pictures on television, film of them, their voices were dubbed by actors, which interestingly gave them a kind of mystery and power. And I remember thinking, why don't we speak to them? Because the British government would not speak to them, they would not negotiate. And I couldn't understand why. But of course, behind the scenes, the British government were talking to them. And it's partly why now Northern Ireland is seen as a very good example of a post-conflict country, region. Yes, it's an imperfect peace, but it is an example, I think, to us all. So when later I became a journalist, I wrote a lot of stories about people who built bridges, you know, whether it was personal or political, whether it was broken families, or broken communities, or broken nations. That was my sort of focus of interest. And then in 2003, I saw this picture. And this is 12-year-old Ali Abbas, whose traumatized eyes stared out from newspapers across the world. His entire family had been killed in the opening days of the Iraq War when a US missile struck his home. And I've cropped the picture because Ali also lost both his arms. And you can see his eyes. I was really, really affected by this photograph. It upset me deeply. A month earlier, I'd gone on the Peace March in London, protesting loudly against the imminent invasion of Iraq. I was convinced the harder you come down on people, the more they regroup and re-emerge in a more resistant and angry way. The language of polarization, which is even worse today, but it's, you know, I remember Bush saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. And I found this so limiting and so dangerous. So I had a small voice, I was a journalist. I thought, what can I do? So I started collecting stories. These I didn't collect, I collected in 1 year 26 stories. I wanted to create a counterbalance to the endless stories of demonization and hatred which were all around, and which sadly, as I say, are even more prevalent today. Stories of victims whose response to harm and violence was not a call for revenge, but a quest for restoration and healing. I was also interested in the lived experience of perpetrators, those who transform their aggression into a force for peace. So this was an experimental project. I didn't know what would happen. I was working with a photographer in my spare time, but I wanted to find evidence of how to break the cycle of revenge. You know, I wanted to understand the process. What might it take? You know, you could call it the inner path to peace and the outer path to peace. And I wanted to find out how people did it, really. And I wanted to share it with others. So these stories then became the F word. It became an exhibition. I thought how to share these stories. And I thought it would be a one-off, and I thought my life would go back to journalism. And it launched in 2004 in London. And it was a success beyond my wildest imagination. It drew in widespread media attention, attracting thousands of visitors. I think in the aftermath of the bitter Iraq war, these narratives of hope seemed to tap into a deep public need to find humanity in places of hate. And so a few months later, to satisfy the multiple requests I was getting to use these stories as a tool for peace building, I founded the Forgiveness Project charity, a non-profit, as a means of taking the work further. And the Forgiveness Project remains today an organisation that works with people of lived experience, real stories, with the aim of understanding how people recover and rebuild after periods of conflict in a restorative way, post-trauma. And just to share a little bit about what the Forgiveness Project does, because I'm a journalist, I want to get stories out there, I want to get messages out there. So we have a website, we do podcasts. I've written 3 books on the subject. We put public events, we do online events. We have a prison program called Restore, run by victims of crime alongside ex-offenders. And we have the exhibition, which has now been seen by 80,000 people in 17 countries across the world, multiple settings in different ways, designed in different ways. People print up their own exhibitions. So it's been, for instance, in a shopping mall in Sydney, an EU building in Brussels, a hospital in the south of England, and a community building in rural Kenya. So I love the way that people use these stories for their own work. That's what I wanted. And because my background is journalism, I understand the power of story. I've seen how stories stick, whereas facts fade. I know that people's beliefs and biases only shift when we hear the stories of others. So they're this incredible tool to build empathy and understanding. They stimulate our imagination and make you somehow invested in someone else's life, so you walk in their shoes. I really think stories can unlock closed hearts and prise open narrow minds. But there's a dark side to everything, isn't there? So stories can harm as much as they can heal. They can fan the flames of prejudice. They can normalize hate, especially in this digital age where the internet has turbocharged abuse and where misinformation deliberately seeks to confuse. So this is why, if you want to use stories as a peace-building tool, you must work with what I call restorative narratives, healing stories, redemptive stories, stories that heal, restore, and rehumanize. You heard 4 of them yesterday. So this is one of my favorite quotes, sums up exactly what I'm trying to say, by the British Ghanaian poet Ben Okri. He says, stories are the secret reservoir of values. Change the stories individuals and nations live by and tell themselves, and you change individuals and nations. So a year before the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, I was in Rwanda, and I spoke to someone at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. And he warned me that critical to the peaceful future of his country would be the stories that people chose to share to mark the approaching anniversary. He was expressing a need to, yes, remember the pain and brutality of the genocide, but also to highlight stories which celebrated healing and reconciliation, and which showed how communities could recover and how hearts could mend, despite nearly 1 million people having been slaughtered over 100 days in 1994. These stories they saw as a key tool in maintaining peace. And last year, I was in Rwanda again, and it was the 30th anniversary since the genocide now. And I was told that 85% of the population now are under the age of 30. So that means the vast majority of Rwandans were not alive at the time of the genocide. And yet, peace is secure but fragile, I would say. And how they remember the genocide is very important, how it's memorialized. So simply using stories that shame perpetrators and their families will not secure peace. And I think the words of Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela are very useful here. She's a psychologist from South Africa. And if you take the word memory to be story, it says the same thing, really. If memory is kept alive in order to cultivate old hatreds and resentments, it's likely to culminate in vengeance and in a repetition of violence. But if memory is kept alive in order to transcend hateful emotions, then remembering can be healing. So this is why I choose to work with restorative narratives. So let me be more precise about what a restorative narrative is. And indeed, you may want to collect one yourself. You may want to share it with others. You can do it on social media. You can do a podcast, a little film. These are what Steve from the Global Peace Index called transformational stories of life. So, restorative narratives are rooted in inquiry rather than argument. So they're stories with nuance, with complexity. They're multi-dimensional. They have nuance. They don't necessarily end happily, but touch on themes of survival and growth. They demonstrate how people and communities can rebuild and recover after periods of disruption. And they shift the traditional journalistic focus, which is so often on tragedy. Remember what we were told yesterday, if it bleeds, it leads. And they focus more on recovery. So, for example, stories from where people are indifferent or full of hate, moving to compassion, or from division to dialogue, or from indifference to strength. And they showcase content that acts as a force for good in the world. So they showcase humanity. And as one of the speakers said yesterday, these stories are extraordinary stories of survival and advocacy. So perspective is key. I just wanted to take you into the mindset and take you into this scenario. Imagine a father who's lost a beloved daughter in inter-ethnic violent conflict. So there are two ways of responding, two polarized ways of responding to this pain and trauma. One way is restorative. So let's look at narrative A, really, is the father thinks these people who did this to my daughter are inhuman, bloodthirsty thugs, and I must do everything to stop them. I must dedicate my life to getting rid of them in order to honor my daughter. Reasonable. You can understand why he would say that. But he could also reframe this. I must dedicate myself, you might say, to minimizing violence and to healing the conflict. I must dedicate myself to peace and reconciliation in order to honor my daughter. And I've met so many people who really believe more in the perspective of narrative B. And I'm just going to share you one story right now. One of the stories that I've collected over the years. This is Figan Murray. She lives in England. Her 29-year-old son, Martin, was killed in the 2017 Ariana Grande concert in Manchester in the UK. It killed 22 people, many of them children. So at first, in the days after her son's murder, she felt nothing but despair, anger, extreme shock. What changed was when she opened a newspaper one morning and saw a photograph of another terror attack. There were quite a lot in the UK at that time, and this was an attack on a London mosque. A white supremacist had driven his van into people, killing one person and injuring many more. The man had then ran from the vehicle, fallen, and an angry mob had gone to attack him. The photograph that Figen saw showed a human chain forming round the far-right extremist to protect him. The human chain was made up of the imam of the mosque and 4 Muslim worshippers. They were protecting the man who'd come to kill them. So this powerful depiction of compassion, peace, stayed with Figen all day, and it seemed to soothe her grief. She realised that the attack which killed her son at the concert had been because of an appalling lack of tolerance and an appalling lack of compassion on the part of the suicide bomber and his accomplices. And therefore, the only way she knew of shifting the dynamic was by demonstrating these very values that had been so lacking when her son was killed. And she says something that others have said to me in different ways. She said, "Forgiveness became the vehicle I used to stay within my humanity." And I was reminded yesterday when Long was talking about her experience from Cambodia. Do you remember she didn't want to put more pain into the world with her words? This is similar to what Figen felt. So by that very evening that she'd read that paper, Figen had made up her mind that she had to forgive and that she would say so publicly on national television. So forgiveness became a very public act of resistance. Many times it's been lonely for Figen, isolating. She's lost friends for her position, but it has kept her within her humanity, and she's become a phenomenal peace builder. So isn't that interesting? One restorative narrative read by the newspaper by Figen led her to completely change her vision, her view, her perspective. I love what these academics say. A story told at the right moment in someone's life could shine a light sufficiently bright to illuminate the way ahead on the map of life. So, those like us here today who hear a restorative narrative, it can help shift our worldview. And for victims who tell their stories, it's empowering for them to be witnessed. It gives a sense of meaning to their suffering. As Claude said yesterday about Rwanda, telling our story is our survival. While for those who were perpetrators, telling their story can be an act of redemption, reparation. Many have a yearning to help others. I've worked with lots of ex-offenders because of our prison program, and they are like the poet, the mystical poet Rumi talks about people who have harmed then becoming a lamp or a lifeboat or a ladder. I love that. A lamp, a lifeboat or a ladder. And Assad Shaftari would agree with this. He was a commander many years ago in the Christian militia during the Lebanese civil war, way back. He was responsible for deciding who lived and who died for many years. And then everything changed. I won't go into the complexities of his stories, but he's become a big peace builder in Lebanon, needed more than ever today, of course. The conflict then drew to an end. He felt remorse at what he'd done, and he wrote a public letter in the newspaper of apology. And as Assad says, "I would venture into the jaws of hell if my story could shift just one person's mind and move them away from violence." So I'm just going to talk a little bit about forgiveness now. One thing I've learned in 20 years at looking at this subject is that it's a very complex subject. Whole books and theses and, have been written about definitions. And I've settled on one very simple definition, but there are multiple ones really. For me, I sort of think forgiveness is making peace with yourself, or that's self-forgiveness, or with things or with people that you cannot change. But of course it's more than that, because it's not just about letting go and acceptance. It requires a degree of empathy and compassion for the person or people who've hurt you. And that's the difficult bit. And what I've learned from 20 years working in this field is that forgiveness is multi-dimensional, open to interpretation, easily misunderstood, not always welcome, not always appropriate, as well as, of course, being hugely transformational. But it's important to remember the dark side. Critics indeed say forgiving a wrongdoing can be damaging because it rewards bad behaviour. And in some cases, this may be true. It's not an automatic miracle cure. And you could say the power of forgiveness is precisely in the fact that it can be refused. So I read about a woman in this book, which I wrote a chapter about. It's a really interesting book about multidisciplinary focus on forgiveness. So it covers social work, health, all sorts of areas. And I wrote about our prison program when I wrote the chapter. But in the book, when I was reading it, I came across a woman who was a victim of sexual violence. She understood the power of the restorative power of forgiveness, but she was withholding her forgiveness as an act of defiance. And she said, I don't forgive my abuser. I would be wrong, in my view, to do so. I'm not just an individual, I'm a woman. And I stand in solidarity with others, regardless of gender, who have been abused. However, there is no doubt that forgiveness is a very effective, as someone I once heard say, from Hawaii actually, she said, forgiveness is a very effective public health tool. Why do governments not talk more about it? Numerous research studies have shown that having a forgiving personality benefits your physical and mental health because it means you're less likely to hold grudges. You will give people the benefit of the doubt. You want people to get along. You're less likely to have expectations and assumptions about how others should behave and how others should be. You'll be happier. You'll have healthier life. You'll have better relationships. There are, as I say, multiple research studies, very rigorous, robust studies which show this. In fact, one study showed that it was called Forgive to Live. It was, done over many years. It showed that if you have a forgiving mentality with your spouse, with your wife, husband, partner, you will live 3 years longer. Interestingly, that study also showed that there was one exception in situations of domestic violence. That was not the case. That made perfect sense to me. If you forgive abuse that's happening to you, you're in fact you may just be allowing the abuse to continue. So I've also found that people take two very distinct positions about forgiveness. You could call it conditional and unconditional. And I think conditional is where people believe forgiveness must be earned. It must be earned through someone changing, through remorse, or through apology, through making amends and building bridges. So it requires a relationship between the harmed and the harmer. Unconditional forgiveness is people who believe that forgiveness is an act of self-healing. And if you're waiting for an apology or for someone to change, you may be waiting forever, then the power is still in that other person's hand. And there's no right or wrong. But let me give you a couple of examples. So Ruchi Singh, the woman on the left, I actually met here in this room 4 years ago at this very conference. She was a victim of domestic violence in Australia. At times, she feared for her life. She came originally from India. She'd left her family behind. She was in a terrible, coercive, controlled situation. Eventually, she managed to escape the grip of her husband and flee back to her home in India. And her husband never acknowledged, he never apologized. Instead, he just spread lies about her. But her spiritual practice led her to know that forgiveness was going to allow her to take this path to peace that she's now on, and she needed to forgive her husband. And she says, forgiving my husband was something I needed to do to avoid becoming a negative person. I didn't want to be cruel and hurtful like him. One way of staying internally clean has been to never call him abusive names. I've even blessed him. It's not easy, but it's helped me free myself. And she says to her critics, and of course you can imagine she has critics, how can you forgive this man? She says, it doesn't mean I condone his behavior. It means I can live my life in a more peaceful frame of mind. It makes sense, doesn't it? This is Father Michael Lapsley, and he's from South Africa, and he was a member of the ANC liberation movement during the apartheid era, living in exile in Zimbabwe, when he was sent a letter bomb in the post. Between two religious magazines, they blew off both his hands and left him blind in one eye. The trauma was horrific. Recovery, very slow. But he's interesting. He says he's become a much better priest since then. He can connect with the disenfranchised and the poor and the disabled in ways he never could before. He doesn't hate, but he doesn't forgive, because he needs restitution and accountability before he is willing to forgive. And he says, since I'll never get my hands back and will therefore always need someone to help me, they should pay that person's wages, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution. So he basically is saying, forgiveness would be on the table if I knew who it was I was supposed to be forgiving, but no one's ever come forward. How can I forgive? So forgiveness is a difficult word. Many might say it's a blunt tool when we're talking about political forgiveness. Considering, for instance, systematic and systemic failures or political violence. When I was in South Africa a couple of years ago, people were still suffering from the wounds of the past, from apartheid. And they would often say at question and answer sessions, how can I forgive when there's been no accountability and no justice? And I was sometimes with Father Michael at these events, and he would say, you're asking the right question. Don't ask, can I forgive? Ask, how can I heal? Then forgiveness may come. But I thought that was a very good answer. And now I'm sharing with you some of the inspirational sort of people I've met. So this is another one. He's called Duncan Morrow. He's a lecturer in politics, and he's a peace builder. And he talks about the impossible and yet essential need for forgiveness. So he's talking about impossible in Northern Ireland because in sectarian violence, the question so often is, who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? It's not clear-cut, always. And every side has its own story of victimization, competitive victimhood. So if we're talking about justice being fair, you might ask, what's fair? Do we all agree on the system of justice being fair for both sides? There is a price to achieve peace. Sometimes you pay losing out on justice. I think Manal on day one was talking about this when she's talking about the women. Certainly some victims in Northern Ireland feel that proper justice has not been achieved because a lot of prisoners only served short terms. That was part of a kind of amnesty after the Good Friday Agreement. But it did achieve, there are no bombs going off in Northern Ireland now. But it's important to say, I think, that when we're talking about political forgiveness, forgiveness is time sensitive. People have to be ready for it. It can take years, sometimes generations. And I tend to think that in the heat of hostility, whether it's communities fighting over territory or siblings fighting over inheritance, forgiveness is not helpful. Because at this time, people are hell-bent on survival, on winning, on being the more powerful, on destroying the other. I remember hearing President Zelensky from Ukraine shortly after the invasion by Russia, and it was Orthodox Day of Forgiveness, and he was asked about forgiveness, and he said very clearly, he said, this is not the right time to talk of forgiveness. We talk only of judgment. So forgiveness, mercy, and pardoning are part of what comes afterwards when the violence has stopped and when healing spaces have been created, when the focus is on recovery, on building better relationships, on mending broken hearts. Dr. Eileen Boris is an academic working in international conflict resolution. And in the last few years, she's turned her attention to political forgiveness. She knows forgiveness is a way to rebuild and reconcile, but she believes, like many, and it was said many times yesterday actually, a political forgiveness process must begin with truth-telling, acknowledgement, and accountability. This is the critical first step. Without that, healing is impossible. So note the word acknowledge. It's so important. Without acknowledgement, there is a vacuum, a silence, in which lies grow and wounds deepen. In South Africa, I heard it said often by black people that their continued bitterness came from the fact that still most people have never acknowledged the crimes of the past in apartheid. Similarly, for most African Americans, there is no space for a national conversation on forgiveness when there has been no racial justice for slavery. Brian Stevenson, who's an African American lawyer, founder of Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, believes what is missing in America is shame. While regret or remorse has been expressed by some descendants of slavery, there's no sense of, he calls it disgrace, national disgrace. And he says, without shame, you don't actually correct. You don't do things differently. You don't acknowledge. So most victims and survivors yearn for acknowledgement or remorse or justice, whatever it means to people, as a way of healing, and that will come before they can forgive, usually. Others believe that to wait for acknowledgement, which may never come, keeps you stuck, and therefore forgiveness is still the only way that you will achieve sustainable peace. So there are always two perspectives on these things. I think the ambassador talked about both eyes, using both eyes. So this is Jude White, back to Northern Ireland. He's a Catholic. His mother, Peggy White, was murdered outside the family home by Protestant paramilitaries during this sectarian fighting. Jude's worked for years for victim groups who are still angry that so many combatants served minimal, as I said before, minimal prison sentences. For them, justice hasn't been served. But for him personally, being able to forgive the man who killed his mother has been a lifeline. Before he forgave, he was sliding into alcoholism. His relationships were suffering, his marriage. And he believes that forgiveness could also be a lifeline for his country in terms of the wider unresolved political situation in Northern Ireland. Because while I said it's an imperfect peace in Northern Ireland, schools are still separated, people don't marry too much between Catholics and Protestants. There's still a sort of bubbling undercurrent of hostility. However, Jude has not lost hope because while there is no real violence, the two sides, Catholics and Protestants, could, he believes, if forgiveness was applied, come together in true reconciliation and peace. But, he says, this is the way it is at the moment, somewhat despairingly, he says, I still know a lot of people for whom the totality of their existence is the events that happened several decades ago. It's time to move on. If the dead could speak to us now, they would say, forgive. But most people don't ever forgive because they see it as stampeding all over memories of their loved ones. So his point seems to be, if we don't lay to rest long-standing resentments and forgive old wounds, the past will always haunt us because grievances are passed down the generations through the stories told by teachers to pupils, from parents to children, through the media, through politicians. I think we'd all agree that you can't legislate for forgiveness. State-based institutional forgiveness doesn't work. I mean, can you think of a country or an administration that one could say is forgiving? I don't think so. The world we live in, where opinions are polarized, friends and families ghosted, public figures easily cancelled, is most certainly quite an unforgiving world. Right now in the Middle East, nuance, complexity, and the holding of two perspectives at once, they were quickly lost after the atrocities on October the 7th and the consequential destruction in Gaza. Some governments, however, have tried to nudge citizens in the direction. For instance, the Rwandan government has suggested that ordinary citizens, in order to build peace, ordinary citizens should forgive their fellow citizens who turned on them. But they should not forgive the organisers and the leaders, because they believe only then will society recover. In South Africa, there was criticism of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Too much emphasis, they said, on Desmond Tutu's forgiveness, and not enough emphasis on apology and remorse. But again, you could argue that very emphasis meant there was not a bloodbath, which many predicted when apartheid came to an end. In Sierra Leone, after a bitter civil war, a small charity called Fambletalk, meaning family talk, achieved great things, creating a system of forgiveness rituals as part of a mission to help build peace. They go around the villages and they make bonfires and they encourage dialogue, and because many former perpetrators, like in Rwanda, were going back to the villages they came from and where they had committed atrocities. This is a situation where not everyone can be imprisoned, where you have to create civil society by using these techniques of bringing perpetrators and victims back together. And often forgiveness is a way to do that. So I want to sort of end in a way with just looking at what does it take to live in peace with those who've hurt us? What does it take to restore relationships? What does it take to reconcile with our unresolved pain? What does it take to forgive? In my most recent book about forgiveness, I show this. This is called the Trauma Healing Map, which I think if you look at it, in fact, it was talked about, I think again it was Steve on the first day who talked about the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycle. It's another way of describing this. And it's important to remember that you can jump in and out of these two cycles, but they do show what happens and the stages in a way, although not necessarily in that order. I'd also like to share with you, from the many interviews I've done and stories I've shared, what I think it takes to forgive. 5 sort of key components, key attributes. What are these skills that we might also use in our own lives, that we can use on the path to peace? The first one is being curious. I think it's vital. Having an inquiring mind indicates that you don't have the full story. It helps build understanding for the lives of people different from you. The ability to shift your perspective. If black and white polarized reasoning serves to solidify intolerance, then forgiveness sees the world through a wider lens, softer lens, with fewer fixed expectations how others should be. Finding empathy. Being able to stand in someone else's shoes, no matter how ill-fitting or dirty those shoes may be. This is an innate understanding that, in a way, we are all part of a shared humanity. And then, sorry, that was that one. Letting go of resentment. Bitterness and hatred can be a really heavy burden, load to carry. So relinquishing it becomes an act of self-compassion. It may sometimes require giving up a hard-won sense of power, including the power of being morally right and superior. But it opens up a door to new possibilities. Meaning-making, and this seems absolute, this is where the advocacy word comes in, of the storytellers that we heard yesterday. Many people are capable of bearing great pain if they believe it to be purposeful. In this respect, forgivers sometimes talk about finding the gift in the wound. And that gift can again be a ladder, a lifeboat, helping others. So I am going to end with just one final story, or two stories actually. Two men, Bassam Aramen, here on the left, no, on the right of the picture on the left, and Rami Elaham. Bassam is Palestinian, Rami is Israeli, and they call themselves brothers. And they met through a joint Palestinian-Israeli group called the Parents' Circle. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a club that no one wants to join because it's made out of bereaved family members from both sides of the conflict. And to the right are their two daughters, who were both killed in the conflict. Amir was killed when an Israeli sniper shot her dead, aged 10. Smadar was killed in a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, a good 10, probably more years earlier, when she was 13. So after Rami, I'll just tell you a bit about Rami first. After Rami's daughter was killed, he was living in Tel Aviv. He was totally broken, tormented with anger and grief. He only wanted revenge. Someone eventually invited him along to a meeting with the Parents' Circle, this organization eventually, but he didn't want to go because he said it was going to be full of Arabs, and he didn't want to see any, but he did go. And he says, suddenly I was hit by lightning. He saw his life suddenly in a different way, the path to peace. And from that moment on, hearing the stories of pain, which were the same as his pain, he knew he could become a peace builder, and it would give meaning, back to meaning making, give meaning to his life. And it was here, years later, that he met Bassam, and they formed a relationship, and the two men frequently speak together. Their work has become incredibly difficult, their voice much more fragile since October the 7th. They're fragile, difficult. People don't want to hear this story of peace. People are sort of blinded by the horror of what has happened in both communities. They're blinded to each other's pain. So Rami is interesting about forgiveness. His building of empathy is this understanding. And he says, I do not forgive and I do not forget, but the suicide bomber was a victim, just like my daughter. He was grown crazy out of anger and shame. So Rami says he doesn't embrace the concept of forgiveness, and yet if you meet him, you think, what a forgiving man. But it's interesting, some people do not like the word. They feel it comes barnacled with all sorts of negative associations. This is a whole other discussion about all the negative associations connected to forgiveness. But telling his story has helped change the minds of others, and it's given meaning to his life. And he said this quite recently when we put on an event online with Bassam and Rami. He said, telling my story gave my life meaning and purpose and got me out of bed in the morning. Even those who will not listen end up listening because of the force of the story. So Bassam I met about 10 years ago. He's a former combatant from Palestine, the West Bank. At 16, he tried to blow up an Israeli military convoy with a grenade. He went to prison for several years in Israel. And there he was shown one day a film about the Holocaust. And until then, the Holocaust in Germany, the Nazi, he actually thought it hadn't happened. He thought it was a myth, a lie. And actually wanted to watch this because he said he would enjoy seeing Jews being killed. However, this film changed his perspective completely. And he broke down crying, and he said, it was the first time I felt empathy for my oppressors. And it was the start of a friendship with his guard. He started dialoguing. and they found out things about each other's lives, and it helped him when he was released from prison. He became a co-founder of Combatants for Peace, which is an organization where former fighters on both sides work together to find common ground. And then he joined Parent Circle when his daughter, a few years later, was shot outside her school. Bassam had once hated Israelis, but by knowing them and working together with them, he overcame this hate. And extraordinarily, even after this military man shot and killed his daughter near the school, he refused to hate. Actually, he even forgave the shooter, seeing him as a product of a hateful system. And he says this, he says, "For me, after my daughter's death, there was no return from non-violence. After all, it was one Israeli soldier who shot my daughter, but 100 former Israeli soldiers who built a garden in her name at the school where she was murdered." So when you hear these two men talk, and they always ask the audience not to take positions, they say, don't transport the conflict into your country. They say, work for peace. Hear everyone's pain, even if you feel it's disproportionate. Pain, as I said before, blinds you. The trauma has blinded people to each other's pain. They urge people to start with themselves. Bassam always says, when he's talking to young people particularly, he says, start with your own inner journey of peace, because nothing will change until you do that. So I want to just end with a slide and a saying which I think comes to the heart of the inner journey and why it's really important to consider forgiving ourselves, to consider compassion for ourselves, because the great spiritual thinker Richard Rohr has said, if we want to transform our pain, we will my glasses can't read it. You can all read it anyway. It's wonderful. If we don't transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. Is that right? Thank you very much.